Briahna, I'm so excited to learn what's on your radar today.
Well, Robbie, I woke up to some good news this morning. Sort of. Only after threatening to go on a strike estimated to cost the economy $2 billion a day did railroad workers, the archetypal blue-collar worker that politicians from coast to coast claim to hold up as the country's most deserving, most blue-collar, most essential of workers, managed to secure a concession considered to be a given much of the world over: the ability to take days off for medical care without being subject to discipline. Even though this battle is largely in the rearview mirror, we shouldn't forget what almost just transpired and why. Because moments like this are important mask-off moments which reveal how politicians and corporate media really feel about the working class. After largely ignoring the crisis until last week, media outlets from Fox News to CNN spent the last few days focusing on the impact a rail strike would have on consumers. As the Washington Post reported, if the strike were to happen, retailers would miss their shipping and pickup dates, and the supply chain crisis will become exacerbated. It would even affect the nation's energy supply and drinking water. This is serious stuff, which begged the question: why was management dragging its feet on the workers' demands? Why had workers been working without a contract for years? They must have been asking for something pretty unreasonable, right? Well, it's hopefully obvious to all now that the dust has settled that the only unreasonable party was management. Railroad workers have had to work up to 90% of their waking lives until they retire with no provision for sick days, paid or unpaid. They're on call 24/7, work 80+ hours a week, and one of the largest railroads has an attendance policy that gives its workers just 1 day off per month. That's 12 days total a year. While the white-collar elites that set these schedules enjoy their weekends and holidays, these rail workers do not. This conflict literally wasn't even about higher pay, just the right to take time off and go to the doctor without being fired. As one conductor told the Washington Post, "Living the way we live is absolutely brutal. Our folks are working sick and tired because they can't take a day off." Railroad workers have to be on call to report to work 7 days a week, average away from home terminal time 90+ hours a week, get hurt or even killed because of the unsafe working conditions, said another. "We demand more quality of life provisions," according to the contract, covering attendance policies, vacation, and sick days, end quote. Given how terrible those conditions sound, there must be some reason the railroad companies tried so hard to avoid giving in to the demands, right? Like, maybe they were having a hard time coming up with the money. Nope. Unsurprisingly, it was corporate greed that caused the crisis. Railroad investors like Warren Buffett have made record billions in profits while laying off workers and cutting costs. An investigation by the American Prospect from February found that the consolidation of the railroad industry and a practice known as PSR, or precision railroading, has been extremely lucrative precisely because it squeezes employees to run faster at the expense of worker safety and, apparently, quality of life. This has contributed to nearly 40,000 railroad jobs being lost between 2018 and 2020 alone. That's before the pandemic. The workforce has dropped from 1 million workers in the 1950s to fewer than 150,000 in 2022. And the workers that are remaining have been stretched thinner and thinner while management makes money hand over fist. One worker explained that carriers make 50% profit margins off of railroad worker labor. Meanwhile, BNSF and Union Pacific, two of the largest railroad companies in America, reported record profits in 2021. And according to The Guardian, BNSF has paid out $196 billion in stock buybacks and dividends to shareholders since 2010. But what do the workers get? Not a single solitary day off. Until now. Now, much of the reporting, again, is focused on how disruptive this will be to the economy, as though the onus is on the railroad workers to endure all the inconvenience in the world so that their managers can save a buck. But it wasn't the railroad workers who were shutting down the economy. It was the bosses who couldn't, or really wouldn't, do the absolute bare minimum to support workers who have created these enormous profits for them. How did it get this far in the first place? Apparently, Mayor Pete's brief stints at McKinsey, and as the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, didn't seem to have prepared him for the Secretary of Transportation gig. Perhaps unsurprisingly, since more workers are implicated in this railroad contract negotiation than live in South Bend. And although Biden claimed to be the most union-friendly president in a generation, apparently the bar is sort of low. Now, Biden did, in fact, intervene months ago in the Presidential Emergency Board, via the Presidential Emergency Board, which was supposed to propose a fair settlement that avoided a strike. But it ignored the quality of life issues that were central to the workers' concerns, leaving workers with little recourse beyond striking. Ultimately, with the threat of a national rail strike looming, Biden apparently became personally animated about this issue and helped workers to reach a tentative deal. And I'm sincerely glad for it. But those who would criticize workers for threatening to strike should ask themselves whether they would have secured this tentative victory after years of fighting, but for their ability to strike, their ability to threaten to shut down the nation. This is precisely why unions are so important, and the right to strike must be protected. For all of the symbolic support of workers in this country, there is a troubling antipathy toward the strategies that give them real power. Conservatives in particular have an openly hostile relationship to unions and labor, quite openly siding with corporate bosses. Corporatists in both parties have made it harder to unionize, and conservative administrations have made the National Labor Relations Board, the body tasked with enforcing what labor rights workers do have, toothless at times. Yesterday, BNSF, Warren Buffett's railroad, wrote to Congress urging them to pass legislation that would force rail workers to say yes to contract terms that would grant them 0 sick days. And Republicans seem to be on board, issuing a request to force railroad workers and companies to accept those strike terms. Only Bernie Sanders blocked it, stating, I think uncontroversially, that workers in the freight rail industry are entitled to more than 0 sick days. I wonder what would have happened if he hadn't. When I was in France over the summer during their transit strike, I noted that although traffic was terrible, trains were full, and there was only one rental car left in Paris, a stick shift, thank goodness my mother can drive one, no one complained. The people there understood that their fate, their ability to have good wages and humane time off policies, medical leave and maternity leave, was linked to the efforts of striking laborers, and the workers on strike had the full support of the public. Our workers are just as hardworking, as deserving, as important to our community as French transit workers are to theirs. And I only hope that the real lesson learned here is the importance of solidarity.
So I have to say this because while I don't like Mayor Pete at all and have criticized him a lot on the show, I've criticized him in the past, and people have said, oh, you're criticizing for something that technically isn't under his jurisdiction. And that tweet that Ryan Grimm had, I saw Matt Iglesias respond to it. So apparently there's such a thing, you probably know this, but I didn't, called the National Mediation Board, which is responsible for a government agency that handles disputes in the airline employee industry and with rail employees. And so this is technically not under his jurisdiction. Falls to this board I've never heard of. Linda Puchala is the relevant chairman of this board. She was appointed by Barack Obama and then reappointed by Donald Trump and then reappointed again by Joe Biden. And she was formerly in a union for the flight attendants. So she seems like a very pro-labor person. So.
All right. If the Mayor Pete Hill is the one you want to die on.
I mean, I don't want to die on it. I can't. I've accused him of breaking the entire airline industry before our very eyes, but.
Yeah, well, look, I think that people rightly look to the heads of the secretaries of the departments that oversee the broad authority that's going on in these kind of situations. This isn't the first time that there has been obviously these broad infrastructural issues related to transportation that Mayor Pete has to come under scrutiny for. But the real issue here is why there is a united front, it seems, across government and frankly, largely across parties, although it's important to note that Democrats have been much less hostile, at least much less openly hostile to labor interests than conservatives have over the past, few decades. But why it is that there is so much of a kind of regressive attitude about labor in this country, and it's really bifurcating, I think, our nation. You have a small wave, but a wave nonetheless, of strike actions that are happening across the country, with Starbucks workers unionizing all across the country at the same time that Starbucks, the corporation, is trying to do all kinds of union busting techniques that are illegal. You have a wave of teacher strikes. You obviously have the Amazon strike, unionization effort that has been making headlines all across the country. You know, there is a growing understanding among some portion of the population that we live in a gilded age, and they're finally rising up despite not having the labor protections of old and clawing back some rights for workers. However, there is a level of pushback in this country that is very easy to observe. Even I see among some of my progressive colleagues, where I see a lot of hemming and hawing and eye rolling about, oh, what is this going to do to the country? And it's not that it is wrong for people to be inconvenienced, but there is not that fortitude of solidarity that you see in other places, where folks really understand that the whole point of this, the whole point of the media infrastructure here, is to cause individuals to see themselves as consumers rather than workers, and flip against the workers in these scenarios. And I really hope that this moment is one that starts to teach us more and more what can be gained if we stand in solidarity with each other.
I think all these labor movements are not the same, though. For instance, the teachers, which I'm much less sympathetic to because they're public employees we're talking about, where they're striking against us. We're the people, they work for the U.S. taxpayer, so they're striking again, and which they have totally different incentives than the people who work in rail or at Starbucks or even at Amazon, because all of those employees have to, in their organizing, have to be reasonable because they don't want the company to suffer because they're employees of the company. Whereas when the company is just the taxpayer, which you can always get more money, like we're not going to shut down the schools, so they don't have an incentive to be reasonable the same way people who work for people who are organizing against a private company do.
The average teacher salary is well under $60,000 a year. And whether or not you think that they should have to go to college or get any kind of advanced degrees to be teachers, they certainly do at this moment, which means that teachers have an enormous amount of student debt at the same time that they're paid substandard salaries. I don't have to tell you anything. I'm sure you've read the stories about how frequently teachers are asked, or not asked, but volunteer to use money out of their own pocket to provide basic services for the kids in their schools. And there has been a real abdication of authority to control the poverty crisis to teachers in the education system, as for decades we've been told that the way to pull yourself up out of poverty is simply to get an education. And there has been this hero narrative of individual teachers who have had movie after movie made about them, how they're individually going to change the inner cities and change America. So with all of that on their shoulders, it's hard for me to understand a framing of teachers as somehow being imperious, overly bold, demanding too much, and to be making an argument about how they should have less of an ability to advocate for basic salary rights and interests that they obviously need and deserve.
Teacher salary, it's different in every state. It's basically decent. It's certainly not lucrative. They have very good health compensation packages. They often have pensions and things like that frankly don't even exist in other sectors of employment anymore. They have and they have incredible job protection. The problem with teachers is that high-performing teachers who are very effective, don't have a way to ideally would get better income, would get even better pay, and because of the influence of unions, it's all very standardized, and really you accrue more pay from working there longer, or from seeking even in the middle of your career from getting a master's in education, which I think is actually worthless, but you get more pay for that. We don't pay based on how effective the teachers are. And the unions have contributed to that dynamic.
There are all kinds of reforms that one could advocate. I think the fundamental ability for individuals to gain rights for themselves by withholding their labor, because we believe it to be valuable, is something that shouldn't be impeached. And narratives that paint some of the hardest working and most important members of our society, like teachers, in a light that characterizes them as kind of vultures or somehow overly demanding, when truly I can think of few people who I think deserve their salaries as much or have impacted my life more than teachers, including public school teachers, including my own parents who were teachers. I think that's a real issue, and I think it goes kind of the root of this solidarity issue that I have in this country. Teachers should not be framed as enemies. If you have a problem with a certain policy, let's talk about the policy. If there's something about the architecture of how we plan our society. Let's talk about that. But unfortunately, teachers are not concluded in many people's eyes, I think because of a lot of conservative framing, as workers, when I think that they're some of the most hardworking and important workers that we have in this country.
I had wonderful teachers. I mostly went to private school, and those teachers were paid less than their counterparts in the public sector, and they were fantastic. But
and that's a shame, and that's why I think that there's a much broader conversation to be had about unions and why it is that different sectors have been able to secure different levels of rights for themselves. But certainly the fact that one group gets more than another group, and I've seen this a lot in this conversation about the railroad workers, should not mean that you don't advocate for all of the groups to be getting more, because I think that's what's obvious is that workers in this country are getting nowhere near across the board what they deserve.
I don't know about that, but I appreciate your radar as always, Briahna. More rising after this.